Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Google Hangout from PPP Days event, which is being held in London at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Thanks very much for joining. We've got a great panel here this afternoon, and we're going to be answering questions that you've asked, as well as some additional questions that have come up over the last day and a half of the PPP Days event. My name is Lawrence Carter. I'm the PPP Director at the World Bank Group. And on my left, we have Thomas Meyer, who is the Managing Director of Infrastructure at the EBRD. We have Pradeep Singh, who is Dean of the Indian School of Business. And we have Julia Prescott, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Meridian, which is a major investor in infrastructure. Just to remind ourselves, we've got over 23,000 people who've signed up to the PPP Mooc. I think it's the first Mooc on this topic from 199 countries from around the world. And it's been terrific to see the level of engagement on the discussion forum. So we're going to turn to your questions in a moment, but before that, I'm going to ask the panelists to give some of their impressions of what they've heard from the PPP Days event here at EBRD. Just as a reminder, PPP Days has been going for quite a few years, and it's an event which brings together government officials, development partners, and investors from the infrastructure and PPP world, from around the world, to talk about how to make better decisions about PPPs, to find out the state of the market, and to learn from share experiences. So let me turn to you, to each of you, each of the panelists, and just ask you, what have been your main takeaways from the conference so far? Thomas?
Thank you, Lawrence. My main takeaway, I think, has been that with the sponsorship, the political sponsorship of the G20 over the last 2-3 years, who have made infrastructure a really central topic, we have a lot more buy-in in terms of developing infrastructure and also addressing the issues associated with infrastructure. And what struck me over the last 2 days is actually the level of engagement that we have now, both at expert level, but also with the general public, about what makes PPP successful, why we need more private sector involvement in infrastructure provision, and also the pros and cons of this all. So for me, the great takeaway here is that infrastructure is really top of the agenda now, and the MPs as a group are now coming much closer together to help develop this market.
Very, very upbeat. Pradeep, what do you think? What do you?
Yeah, Lawrence, it's always great to be at the PPP Days conference every 2 years, and I always look forward to coming back to meet old friends, to make some new friends. It's also a very efficient way of catching up with what's happening around the world. I know we, of course, are in the PPP space in our own countries, but you get so embroiled in your own local challenges and local politics that very often you forget what's going on around you, and it's a great way of efficiently learning about what's happening. It's a good mix that they have of sessions devoted to different themes and having countries come and talk about what's happening there. This morning, for example, listening to Philippines and Bangladesh and other countries about their own experiences was very good. It's good to know that the PPP movement is alive and kicking. It's in fact expanding. It's getting new followers and new converts. It's also not surprising to learn that there are lots of problems, and people are finding ways and means of addressing them rather than giving up. So, on the whole, very upbeat.
Very good. From an investor perspective, how do you see things, Julia?
Well, I'm delighted to have been able to come to PPP Days. And as a newbie on the scene as far as PPP Days is concerned, I've been incredibly impressed by the variety of both attendees and also thought streams that have been going on. And I've also been impressed by the general maturing of thinking around PPP. I think that specific areas are now being picked out as the ones which further support and resources can be made available to them, such as the whole area of project preparation. collaboration, the areas that Thomas has been talking about, improving communication, and making it much more of a global area of discussion, as opposed to perhaps sometimes in the past people have been too focused in on their projects and their specific activities. And that's been something that I found particularly impressive over the last few days.
Very good. And you mentioned resources. Well, one resource of the event itself has been the streaming of the very first event, the opening panel. That was streamed and is available on the Mooc site. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do look. It was a really great panel. So let's get into some of the questions we've received before this session, and then later on in the session we'll be taking live questions as they come in. So I'm going to turn to you first, Pradeep. We've had the way we've done the questions is we've sort of grouped them because we've received hundreds of questions from you, but we've grouped them into particular themes. So we had quite a few questions about government capacity, about institutional frameworks. So Pradeep, what can governments do to get a good PPP program to attract investors like Julia and her organization? What can governments do, and what can we and those development partners do?
Yeah, Lawrence, I have been part of the journey in India, but starting 18, 19 years ago, 20 years ago, when really we were essentially completely unaware of what it takes to be a successful PPP environment. So I've seen this happen, and I would say that first and foremost, it's very important to acknowledge the weakness, to recognize that it takes a lot of work before you can get the architecture and the engineering done, which prepares the ground for you to introduce public-private partnerships. Nothing can do more harm than a half-cocked kind of an approach. You sort of rush in without having done your homework, without having prepared the ground, because then the backlash in terms of failure and delays actually sets the clock back. So having recognized that it takes that work, you've got to figure out that it takes work at the legal level, creating policies, creating relevant laws very often that you require. In India, for example, today we have a very large toll road program, but it'd be interesting for you to know that in every state of that country, we've had to amend the Indian Tolls Act by going to the legislature of every state, because unless that was done, it was illegal to toll a road by a private party. So that kind of work had to be done before you could put a road in place. So creating that framework is important. Then again, at the transaction level, at the project level, one needs to acknowledge that you need expertise, and very often you have to get it from overseas, from multilaterals, from consulting organizations. And there is no shame in admitting that we don't know how to do it. And if you're going to try getting investors to come in, we need contracts and we need financing documents that are bankable, that will withstand international scrutiny. In ILNFS, the Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services, where I learned all that I know about public-private partnerships during my 10 years there, we got enormous help from the World Bank. The World Bank had given us a line of credit. And in trying to move that line of credit into PPP projects, we, every 3 months, had the mission from Washington come out and call us on what we were doing. And in the process, we developed the environment and social policy, we developed contracts, we developed what became best practice concession agreements for the country as a whole. So reaching out to successful countries, reaching out for expertise is the second thing we need to do. And thirdly, if I may say so, one can phase in the PPP. It doesn't have to be a big bang BOT project from day one. You could start with a service contract or a management contract or a leasing contract, which requires less preparation, less data, less transfer of risk from the public sector to the private sector, till such time that the muscle is built and you are more ready to take on the more complex and more financial risk intensive PPP projects.
Thank you. Thomas, what would you add to that from the perspective of a major international development institution?
It's quite interesting when we look at our own business. For each dollar we invest or lend in PPPs, we lend about $4 to public enterprises, water companies, state-owned enterprises, road agencies, and so on, on a non-sovereign public risk basis. Why do we do that? Because we need to prepare the partners institutionally, financially, commercially, and in terms of service orientation to deliver better services. And I fully agree with you, but this is a very long journey, which does not necessarily have to end in a fully fledged PPP. There are many other options the public sector has, and on the road to a PPP, there has to be a very careful evaluation, both value for money and public sector comparator, to determine whether a PPP is the best option for delivering public service. And so, you know, in some countries, this journey has been much faster. In Turkey, for example, in Russia, and in other countries, it's still ongoing, and it just shows the complexity and diversity of the problem.
Thank you. So, Julia, from the perspective of an investor, I mean, you've got limited resources, and you need to devote those to the countries where you think it's most likely that they are going through these processes described by Pradeep and Thomas properly. How do you decide or make that judgment, which countries are really doing this?
I think it's, as I was saying earlier, the whole PPP world is becoming much larger, and it's very important for us as investors to make sure that when we're looking at a country, we feel that there is a very embedded sense of what a PPP project is, and that will come within the institutions that we feel that we're either talking to people who have great willingness, both at the political and also institutional level, to carry out a PPP, but also have either a degree of expertise or that they have got advisors around them that can provide them with a great deal of support. Another area that we'll tend to look at is that of to what extent is there a pipeline. As an investor, we expect to live in a competitive environment. We want to make sure that within that environment we are going to succeed. We recognise from time to time we're going to fail. But if we feel that there's a really good commitment and a longer term commitment of projects coming out within a pipeline, we feel that that's going to be much more a better place for us to be and a better place for us to invest. So it's a market with commitment, it's a market with understanding, it's a market with prospects that we will come into. And I certainly echo Thomas's point, certainly in relation to Turkey, for example, has showed all those different aspects of a marketplace, and you know, we feel we have been successful there in a competitive environment. But other markets we look at and we think maybe they've got a little bit further to go in terms both of their legislation and background before we're really strongly going to be able to invest.
Is it maybe this question is for you, Thomas. You mentioned a couple of very interesting statistics yesterday, and I think that the Mooc participants might like to hear those, the figures you started the meeting off with. But in addition, is it only big countries like Turkey which are able to attract investors, or are there some examples of smaller countries which have been able to do that? Thomas, yeah. You told a good story yesterday.
Well, you know, the figures that I mentioned were two, and one was that only 10% of global infrastructure delivery is actually through PPPs. That means that 90% is through conventional or commercialized public sector infrastructure. And I think this is a statistic that we always need to keep in mind, because PPPs are not a panacea, and we can generate a certain uplift in infrastructure delivery through partnership with the private sector, but in essence, the brunt of the infrastructure gap that still remains to be closed needs to be closed in essence through increased user charges, whether they are within PPPs or within public sector arrangements, and of course with bankable and solid public service obligation arrangements between the public sector and the service provider, because not all services, not in all services can you fully cover your cost. For example, in urban transport, in metro services, it's very clear that there is a significant public sector payment necessary to keep ticket prices at reasonable levels. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we talk about PPPs. We cannot move from a 10% scenario to a 50% scenario because there is neither the capacity of the private sector globally to deliver that, nor is there, I think, the political buy-in everywhere and the legal and regulatory framework necessary to do that. Now, big markets, small markets. I think it's interesting to see that for big markets, investors have more feelings, higher levels of risk, because in a sense they enter into a market with a bigger pipeline where they say, okay, we will hopefully win quite a number of projects, and we will have a portfolio that will balance out certain risks. For smaller countries, this is not necessarily the case, but it's interesting to see that in our countries, the EPRD countries of Central Eastern Europe, Turkey and North Africa, we have a PPP practically in each and every one of our countries. And for example, in the airport sector, you have that, whether it's Yerevan, Tbilisi, Tirana, you have a lot of small countries with PPP projects in airports. Ports is a similar story. Those countries that have a good port industry, whether they are small or big, offer opportunities. But I agree with Julia that, of course, for investors to move in force, there needs to be a certain market size.
Mm-hmm. Very good. What about, Pradeep, the role of transaction advisors? We had several questions about that. Are transaction advisors important? What do transaction advisors do? How important is that for a government?
I think it's very important for governments to have transaction advisors. First and foremost, of course, primarily to bring in the expertise. At the end of the day, a successful PPP project is about very carefully balanced allocation of risks, which is enshrined in multiple contracts which form a web together. And selecting the private partner through a bid process is a competitive process that needs to be managed carefully, which is to manage in a way that gets you the best possible partner. At the same time, it's transparent, is one which will withstand public scrutiny, which will not, as it is, public-private partnerships are sometimes, perhaps very often misunderstood among the people, and therefore as potential areas for conflict of interest between public and the private. So it's important that it's carefully balanced, the whole process, and therefore a high-quality transaction advisor can bring that knowledge as well as credibility to the process.
If I could add something there, I think that it's very important to be working with a transaction advisor who has seen a transaction through right from the very beginning to the end, to see what it's like to get to financial close, for example, on projects. There are quite a lot of advisors out there who are very good at developing the initial concepts, but it's actually making sure that there is support right the way through to the financial close and the actual investment of the funds and the start of construction. Because I think sometimes it's there, but it's really vital to have somebody supporting.
Absolutely, and I think that the advisor needs to be aware that he or she is going to be held responsible for ultimate success. In fact, that also brings into question what kind of compensation structure do you want to have with a transaction advisor? Do you want it to be a success fee based or a success fee heavy compensation structure, so you create that incentive to achieve success? You don't want reports to be generated, spiral bomb reports. You want the project to get done, right?
So I think that's a very important point, because EPRD in the beginning, we had a couple of these retainer contracts, and we realized very quickly that is exactly what we got: reports, but no delivery. and it is very important to have success fee-based contracts. And it's well worth negotiating hard with the advisor.
The other interesting role that I've seen transaction advisors play at times, it's almost like the role of a matchmaker, you know, and in India, very familiar with arranged marriages. It's sometimes difficult for the two parties to talk to each other directly.
Mm-hmm.
They need someone in between who they can trust, an honest broker, if you like, and who can absorb some of the stresses of that interaction. Because very often it's a question of give and take. People tend to see it as a win-lose game, and you need someone to balance the risks and rewards. And that ability to speak both the languages of the private sector and understand the sensitivities of the public sector, and being able to go into side rooms and say, listen, you know, this is what's going to make it work, is a very useful thing to have, particularly at the current state of evolution of competencies. Perhaps there will come a day when we won't need the transaction advisors. The governments will have the capacity to bid out projects and structure them properly. The private sector will be able to get them. Right now, we need the services of that critical mass of expertise.
I think that, Pradeep, that brings us on. We've had a lot of questions about this very issue of trust and indeed how to build trust, the trust of civil society around PPPs as well. And just going to your point, I mean, after all, many PPP contracts are 20 plus years, which is, you know, compared to many marriages. I mean, it's a long investment. So, Julia, what's the process? What are the lessons you've learned from observing transaction advisors build a constituency or an atmosphere of trust, and enabling the government and the investors to talk to each other, and bringing the civil society into the discussion beforehand? Because after all, you as an investor don't want to invest in something that is not going to be acceptable to the population, do you? So what good practices have you seen?
Well, I sometimes see not as good practices as I would like, but possibly in the context, just taking it back from the actual position of the transaction advisor into maybe the infrastructure industry more widely, which I think is not at its best in the public relations sphere. I think that there's sometimes a natural inbuilt distrust between public and private sector. You know, is the private sector trying to get the last penny out of this? You know, is the public sector being terribly slow at delivering? And it seems to me that that's one of the very first gulfs to be actually bridged ahead of getting into transactions. And there was some extraordinarily negative publicity about PPPs, PFIs as it's called in the UK, which had a very negative and undermining effect on the whole idea of there being benefit in the private sector coming together. And I think one thing the infrastructure industry could do is to talk a little bit more about the good things and the benefits that have come out of public-private partnerships, about the benefits of having, for example, whole life costing, of the fact when you enter into a PPP contract, you know for the next 30 years, for example, that somebody's going to be dealing with potholes on your road.
Because otherwise they don't get paid.
Otherwise they don't get paid, that somebody's going to be filling the holes in the school roof. And it's not just going to be a question of whether or not there's enough money in the budget for some potentially fiscally constrained country. So one of the big things that I think could be done possibly better by the infrastructure industry is to talk more widely in the press, on various forms of media, about the good things that PPPs can provide. There's another aspect in terms of bringing in civil society that I think is very important, and that is using data that is actually provided about success or failure of infrastructure activities. And I think this was touched yesterday about actually collecting that type of data. We're looking, for example, at 30-year contracts, and we're looking at comparisons within government, and government hasn't collected that data, and yet it says that it's cheaper for me to do it on my own balance sheet. And I think that there's going to be a lot of support from the academic community, for example, And there has been some initial work done both on benefits for education and PPP schools, and benefits for health, PPP hospitals. And all that could be disseminated more widely from the academic sphere. So it's both the industry itself, it's academic, and it builds a wider sense of trust outside individual transactions. And so when those transaction providers come and sit at the table, they're actually in a much more positive environment that both public and private have, through the sort of osmotic quality of the media, actually felt much more positive about what they're trying to get, as opposed to being defensive. And that's one way I think the trust can be built within a more positive environment for PPPs.
Thomas, I think you mentioned an important point, because in a sense, what I perceive is there is sort of a certain information asymmetry between the private sector, who does projects globally and understands the ins and outs of certain infrastructure solutions, and the public sector, who is very often confronted for the first time with a specific infrastructure delivery option. And I think this asymmetry leads to sometimes misconceptions about what the private sector should and could do, what the public sector is supposed to take as a residual or major risk. And our experience certainly has been that in emerging markets, MDBs can play a very useful role prior to the actual transaction advisory stage in creating this knowledge among the public sector players, so that they can see what a PPP looks like through study visits, through comparative material being made available. But also there's a second point, and that is regarding trust. I think in the long term, the best way to generate that trust and understanding is to have a robust, transparent, competitive selection of the private partner, and decide that the PPP option is the right option based on public sector comparator and value for money analysis. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that not just this government, but the next and the one after continues to support this long-term infrastructure delivery.
And I think, sorry, I was just going to finish it by saying, I think that, as again, coming back to something I was saying earlier, there's a lot of focus on the front end of infrastructure projects. And I think building the trust over the longer end, over the operational period, which obviously as investors is critical to us, because that's when we get our return, is a very key part of it. Because I think that we recognise that if costs spiral out of control, or if it becomes too expensive for the public, and that trust has been broken down, then as investors, we are clearly going to be in trouble. So it's actually building over the operational period a feeling of that a benefit is being provided to the public.
Pradeep, there's a very vibrant civil society there is in India. What other more ways in which they can be involved, both up front and through the lives of projects, just to increase the chances of feeling of ownership and quality of scrutiny, involvement?
No, Lawrence, I couldn't overemphasize the need for investing in involving civil society. And I think we are doing far too little at the moment, all over the world, and certainly in India. And we are paying a pretty heavy price for it as well. And very often, by the time you pay the price for it, it's hard to trace it back to the fact that we didn't do the kind of involvement and consulting of the civil society. It seems like a technical issue, it seems like a political issue, it seems like a cost issue.
Right.
But if you really think back, a lot of those issues could have been addressed if there was a very extensive and intensive investment of time, money, energy, creativity. I can remember the Delhi, capital city of India, a very large and ambitious water distribution project, which was structured some 6, 7, 8 years ago, maybe even a little longer, with the very active participation of the World Bank and Pricewaterhouse as the transaction advisors. It took 2 years to structure that project. Extremely well structured, beautifully balanced technically and financially and everything. All set to be bankable and achieve financial close when the local NGOs and everybody else exploded. And everything had to be turned back because we just hadn't brought them into this discussion. And I think this is, by the way, a discussion, but this is an effort that needs to be largely done locally. This is one activity which it does not have a huge role of MDBs and others. Sometimes, in fact, it can be counterproductive to bring in the MDBs into that discussion with the civil society because they themselves become the targets of controversy. This needs to be done by the local politician, by the local bureaucrat, by the local media, and it has to be done slowly. People have to learn the lessons and not just be lectured at. And the kind of issues that Julia is trying to highlight about how it does create the benefit of private partnership needs to be disseminated. And much too often we tend to focus only on the contractors and the consultants and the bureaucrats, and we forget that there is this whole mass of people who are eventually going to pay for this service, who must believe in it before they're going to subscribe to this. Jeffrey from UNEC made this point yesterday at your MDB panel, and we didn't quite pick it up, but I think he was very right on when he said that we need to be investing more on creating that trust and investment.
Thank you. So I think the clear and strong message from the
Yes.
panel about the importance of engagement with civil society. Let's talk a little bit about another group of local stakeholders, namely potential financiers, the local banks, local institutional investors. Thomas, any view about those? Is it important to try to reach out to local investors as well for the political sustainability of PPPs?
Yes, it's extremely important for various reasons. There are infrastructure projects like airports or ports that have a natural foreign currency, hard currency income stream, and where you can finance long-term with dollars, euros, or any other foreign currency. And there are many services, water is one, urban transport is another, where the revenue stream is local. And if you have a local banking system or a local capital market that is able to provide longer-term liquidity, you have a natural partner there to support infrastructure. Secondly, local banks understand their local home market, their home government, and if they are much more willing to take risk than some of the international banks or international institutional investors. What is also interesting is it's not just the financiers but the operators as well. When we look at India, for example, at Turkey, at some Brazil, some other big emerging markets, we see that there is a very competent local operator industry that is now able to deliver world-class quality projects, and that is in a sense a win-win because they are comfortable with the local risk, they have the financial instruments, and they have the know-how to deal with some of the complex social and other issues to deliver a successful project.
From your perspective, Julia, as an investor, do you look sometimes to partner with local investors, local financiers?
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, I think one point I make in the same way that there's the issue about public sector capacity building, I also think there's an issue about local private sector capacity building, because in its way, investment in infrastructure is a fairly specialised part of financing activity, and it's not something that a lot of banks and countries where there have been few infrastructure projects have got a lot of experience with. So it's something that we are keen certainly on supporting in countries where there are, for example, local pension funds that have got an interest in doing asset liability matches over the long term through investing in infrastructure. They're not used to it, but we're trying to engage them because of the currency issues that Thomas is talking about. There's no point in bringing in a whole raft of international institutions that spend the whole time worrying about what the exchange rate is.
Right.
It's much better to have local institutions engaged in projects. And I think there's also the aspect of this virtuous circle of, if you have infrastructure developed in your own country, like pension funds that are investing the funds of future pension payments for future generations, there's a very strong intergenerational aspect which makes the project much more robust over time, and it also makes people buy in much more to the concept of that tram system being there, so that not only can I ride in the future, but I'm going to get money from it that's going to pay me in the future. So that aspect of localism, I think, is very important.
Pradeep, you were the founder of a major domestic financial institution in India. What lessons did you take away from that
We've
experience?
been great beneficiaries of the whole public-private partnership movement in that financial institution. And I think it's obvious that the local financial institutions must lead the way, subject, of course, to the limitations of their balance sheet size and their own technical competence very often. But otherwise, no one is going to understand the business and the local environment better than they. And sooner or later, they have to build the technical capacity to be able to do project finance deals. So having said that, there is, of course, there is room for vibrant partnerships between foreign investors and foreign banks and domestic banks. Very often, the ability to even to do the due diligence on a project finance limited recourse basis is not to be found today in the domestic banks in the emerging markets. They are more used to doing asset-backed lending, and in countries like India and I'm sure China, the growth rate of the economy itself is so high that there is no way that the bank balance sheets are going to be able to support on their own balance sheets alone the requirements of the infrastructure sector. So therefore, we need those partnerships. But otherwise, I can't think of an international investor coming into India and investing without having a local partner. And in this context, by the way, there are some interesting need for innovative financial products. This isn't just about lending. The whole credit enhancement, guarantees, and so on, which both the international banks and multilaterals can participate in, would be very, very useful. Very often the domestic lenders would be ready to move in, but they need the support of a better expert who's able to understand and appreciate and put some dollars behind this, or put a guarantee behind what they want to do. And it would have a huge leverage if we were to be able to create those kind of products.
Did any of you see examples where you felt the local financial institutions were crowded out by international institutions coming into the market, or do you see it as a more complementary?
Yes, I think it's very synergistic. Certainly for a country as large as India, there's no question of crowding out. Our needs are large enough to accommodate both.
I think so. No, sorry, I was just going to say that I think as far as the local institutions are concerned, there is sometimes not sufficient allocation within those local institutions to do the size of infrastructure financing that's required. And there's also potentially not the same teams or expertise available within those institutions to carry out the larger deals. So doing it in partnership can be beneficial. It's part of the technology transfer.
You make an interesting point. You have various countries, and I think you as well, Lawrence, where the local sponsors actually ask MDBs to be part of the financing package for exactly this reason, because they want to ensure that not only do they have contractual arrangements that are solid, but also the partners that know what to do when things go pear-shaped. Because one thing we can be sure about in a 20-year, 25-year period,
you will have a problem.
There will always be some time when you have a problem, and that's when you need to work together, and that's where you need to have had experience in similar situations, and that's something that international banks can provide, and MDBs most certainly.
we're now getting some questions coming in from the participants, so we're going to take some of the live questions. So there's a question about the degree to which PPPs can be used at the municipal level. Thomas, CBRD has done a lot with municipal finance in the region. What's your view of PPPs at that level?
You know, there are quite a number of very successful international players in the municipal sector. French, for example, in urban transport, in heating, in water. We talked earlier about one of the players there, and you know, we have supported those players and also local players in PPPs at the municipal level. It has to be said, though, that you know, if we talk about institutional challenges at national level, to say a toll road, you know, are sometimes difficult enough. When you then move down to regional or local authorities, those institutional challenges sometimes get magnified. And it's perhaps a more challenging, even more challenging environment in some countries, particularly the smaller ones. So we do it, but it has to be said that not for size reasons, but for institutional capacity reasons, that national level PPPs are still sort of more of a market than a level or two down.
What about you, Julia? Does Marina invest in the municipal level?
I mean, I think we'd be very happy to, but the issue really is often one of scale. That at the municipal level, the projects tend to be of a relatively smaller size. And I think that we are always very keen not to get into PPPs where there's complexity and cost involved that is disproportionate to the size of the investment. And one of the things that could potentially make PPPs at the municipal level more effective is if a programme of different projects could be carried out, and particularly on, for example, on the regeneration side, if there with examples of maybe schools or biomass projects or health clinics actually all being incorporated into one particular project. And one of the examples we have in this, which is not specifically municipal, but actually is in the UK under something called the UK LIFT programme, which stands for Local Improvement Finance Trust. And that is one where in a regional area, a series of health projects have actually been carried out, relatively small in and of themselves, and sort of around sort of can be 5 to 10 million per project. And sometimes those projects have included alongside the health, a school project. But because they're agglomerated together under a different scheme with standardisation, that means that it's really been a very effective way for investing in individual economies of scale. And it's those areas, as private sector investors, we want to make sure they're on those economies of scale.
Actually, it's an interesting point. We see the same with energy savings companies, ESCOs, because that's an approach in which you can roll out in a vast number of municipalities through a number of competing private operators. And that has proven to be really effective in driving resource and energy efficiency projects.
And what about India? Have you seen examples of this bundling or scaling?
The issue really, the challenge really is one of scale, and the other the fact that very often the urban level projects are such that it's difficult for user fees to pay for them.
Yes.
Either because it's impossible to collect user fees, say on urban roads, or very often even sewage disposal,
street lighting,
or street lighting.
Yes.
And even things like water, which theoretically it is possible to collect user fees on, but there is a whole history of user fees being extremely small,
yes,
and politically it's very difficult for them to be increased very substantially overnight. So I guess one response is that the kind of public-private partnership projects that you do will be different there. They will be more of the PFI variety, if you like, where the government is the purchaser of services, the principal body. A bulk water supply project or a management contract for maintenance of roads or street lighting and what have you, rather than users paying for them. And the second, as Julia suggested, is to pool the projects together. Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund, TNUDF, which was again supported by the World Bank way back 20 years ago, has been a similar success story, which brought together some 10, 15 municipal corporations. And there is a clutch of projects which they did together. They actually were in the process also able to develop some regional approaches to solving any of those water-related problems. They created a very useful capacity for project preparation. They created financial instruments where the financial risks were getting diversified because they were investing in different municipal corporation projects. So at all levels, the challenges of scale and size were actually converted into a strength. But the players who would be attracted to that business are going to be very different. You're not going to get large insurance and pension funds coming out of these projects. And they will tend to be more local in character.
Which is probably appropriate.
Which is very appropriate, which also allows people to learn on the job. So the nature of the transaction, the nature of the investor, and the programmatic approach are the responses that we've tried in India. Quite successful.
Thank you. So we have another question about unsolicited proposals, a topic that often raises a lot of interest. Thomas, what's the EBRD's view on working with countries that are responding to unsolicited proposals?
Well, we need to go back to fundamental principles. When we look at a public-private partnership that is built on trust and on the long term, we need to have transparency, competition, and the ability to prove that the proposal that is on the table is the best possible proposal for the consumer, the public sector in terms of quality and payment. Now, unsolicited bids are not per se a bad thing, because we have seen, for example, the Dartford crossing. That's a famous example where in a sense bidders were asked to provide a tunnel solution, and where one bidder said, "Okay, I'll give you a tunnel solution, but I'll give you an alternative through a bridge." And that turned out to be much cheaper. So there are situations when they are well managed where unsolicited proposals do actually generate, I think, value for money. But on the whole, in situations where we have institutional challenges, where we have trust challenges, and the issue of PPP being a new product, I think it would be my suggestion, my recommendation, to have a properly structured, transparent, competitive bidding process, rather than reacting to an unsolicited bid.
Julia, from an investor perspective, do you differentiate between whether proposals have been unsolicited or competitively?
I mean, I have really enjoyed Thomas's answer in terms of wanting to invest in a project that's been part of a transparent and competitive process. As the private sector, I'm very conscious of the need to have trust between the public and the private sector. I think that unless the unsolicited bid could be very much proven to be open, transparent, competitive, that it really could show that it had value for money, it wouldn't be something that we as private sector investors would be very interested in, to be honest, because it is a concern sometimes that if unsolicited bids come in, it's seen that there's some influence taking place, that it's not really been tested, and that talking about what I was earlier about not just the building of the project, but the longer term, that we wouldn't want questions to keep coming back about whether or not it was the right thing to do. We wouldn't want a breakdown of trust. And that, as you said, there have been some good unsolicited bids, but they have been then gone through the proven approach. And
right.
The concept, I was really interested in the promotorial concept initially, where you were allowed to come up with an unsolicited bid, but then it went through a competition process.
Yeah.
It seemed to be a better way of doing it rather than trying to push an unsolicited bid through.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to another question that's just come in from the Mooc participants also, interestingly enough, came up yesterday here at the PPP Days event, which is what's the best way to measure the performance of a PPP project? Pradeep, you've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of PPPs. What's the answer to that question?
That's a tough one. It's a very difficult one, really. And I do want to say that any formulaic way of trying to do it, even the relatively sophisticated looking BFM tools and public sector comparators and so on, I don't think do full justice to what's really at stake. And public-private partnerships I see not just as a means of getting technical managerial efficiencies, which of course it is. It's also not just a means of accessing private capital, which also of course it is. But it's really an implementation strategy. It's almost like an alternative system of governance where you're trying to bring accountability center stage, where you're trying to link performance with rewards, where you're trying to do things which wouldn't get done otherwise. So how do you, what's the counterfactual when you look at a PPP project? I would rather say, let's go to the fundamentals and say, why do we look at PPP? What are the drivers? And when you list those, you can see that there is value in it. Now, you may not be able to realize it always because of all kinds of other difficulties. Other than that, the proof of the pudding will lie in the eating. I know it's tempting to jump in and say, let's use this tool and let's do this matrix, and let's do these numbers and figure out if it's a success or not. But I would stay away from that.
I would add to this, it's kind of interesting for an institution that does both public sector finance and PPP finance. We see, for example, that the implementation period for a PPP is significantly shorter than the equivalent public sector project, sometimes as much as half. And that tells me that a PPP project delivers services for the customers, for the clients, for the voters in half the time than a public sector solution would. And then in terms of measuring success, I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the performance measurements for public roads companies in our countries of operations. They oftentimes have very few tools to measure their performance, while under a PPP contract, the toll road operator, has a myriad of performance indicators that he has to manage. Like R1 in Slovakia, if there is a lane closure of a certain period of hours, that immediately has an impact on the level of payments by the public sector towards the concessionaire. And these are things that really keep performance levels up. And as was said earlier, you have a partner that fixes the potholes, that makes sure the asset will remain in operation. And I think that is the big attraction in the sense of a PPP project, of a properly structured PPP project. You have a partner for the next 20 or 25 years who delivers this service.
And I'd have to say, I think performance is very important to be measured, because I think it gives us benchmarks. And I think we can use those benchmarks going forward to decide about whether or not, or to provide supportive data to governments as to whether or not they want to do public-private partnerships. We said at the beginning that only 10% of infrastructure is potentially coming through public-private partnerships. I think the figures show that actually we need more than 10% because of the potential gap in government finances. And the more data we can get, the more benchmarks we can get, the better argument that we can provide in the future for governments to actually undertake PPP projects, for investors to come in, and actually for us to go somewhere towards narrowing that infrastructure.
That brings us to another question that's been asked, which is about investment trends. And what have you seen, let's say in the last 5 years, particularly focused on the last year or two, things went down after the crisis. Did some players withdraw from the market? What's been your perspective on that?
Well, I think we've seen an extraordinary turnaround in the last really 2 to 3 years in terms of the interest and willingness to invest in infrastructure right the way across the entire investor base. I mean, we were talking about, I was talking about this yesterday with one of the participants, and talking about closing a project in 2009, when we were scratching about to find whoever would invest in it. Now we're talking about investing, a theoretical wall of money coming into infrastructure, really from pension funds increasing allocations, insurance companies. And in a way, what we see in investment trends is that there's also always been a suggestion of a bubble in the brownfield sector, which has been a natural home due to its perceived relative simplicity for investors. And they're now moving towards greenfield investment. So this extraordinary turnaround has taken place in a relatively short space of time, largely driven by yield requirements. As interest rates and returns have gone down in the rest of the world, investors are looking for better places to put their money in. But there's almost a bit of a mismatch at the moment. There's too much money looking for too simple solutions, possibly not enough money looking for the more complex solutions, and the more complex solutions are not making themselves possibly standardized enough for that more money to get there. So I can see over the next couple of years that we are potentially going to see more balancing out between the two.
Thomas, any additional comments on that?
No, I can only echo what you said, and it's really interesting for us. 3-4 years ago, we would effectively have no capital markets driven infrastructure solution. But now, whether it's in Turkey or Slovakia or Russia or elsewhere, there are more and more capital markets driven, pension funds, insurers driven financing solution. And that I think is sort of a new phenomenon, opening up new liquidity for infrastructure. And of course, it is because the yields elsewhere are depressed, and infrastructure, interestingly, as an asset class, is a very secure one. At your World Bank annual meeting recently, Moody's presented a study on defaults in infrastructure, and it's very clear that number one, that the rates are very low, about 2.3%. And what is also interesting is that there's practically no distinction between mature markets and emerging markets in terms of default rates. So it is becoming an interesting way of investing your money wisely.
We're coming to the end of our Google Hangout. I'd like to ask each of you to leave behind a message for the participants, starting with you.
Well, this is what I just heard from Thomas and Julia is music to my ears, because India is of course very, very hungry for capital. And infrastructure in India is even more hungry. And to know that insurance funds and pension funds are going through this metamorphosis, which is opening their hearts and wallets to investing in infrastructure is very good news. We've been trying to, in India, structure various products. The debt funds became quite well known a couple of years ago. They are in the market looking for funds. It's another matter that, ironically, India is going through a bit of a downturn. I hope it's a temporary one, in its enthusiasm for public-private partnerships right now. So in a sense, the timing is not so great. Just when the markets are getting ready to invest, our own internal structural issues, whether it's around the issue of land acquisition or being able to renegotiate contracts and the NPAs in the banks, and overly enthusiastic bidding which happened for the road sector a year or two ago, the power sector jam, the shortage of coal, food supply, environment concerns, the real economy issues, if you like, surrounding infrastructure have caught up with us altogether. And we're trying to unravel those, and hopefully we can do that in time to be able to bring in all this money into India, into the infrastructure sector.
Thank you. Julia, last 30 seconds soundbite for the participants.
I think it's very exciting to be engaging in these types of conversation, because we're talking about a topic that's becoming globally interesting. We're having much more in-depth conversations, and as an investor, we're excited to see the potential for the future.
Well, we are at the start of an information revolution in infrastructure. Knowledge Lab, this instrument that we are here online, and my message to participants would be, keep your suggestions coming in, because we are interested in listening to what you have to say. because many of you are making really good points, very good suggestions, and I think over the next few weeks, months, we need to digest what happened over the last 2 days, what has come in from the market, and then further develop our knowledge products to make sure that the private sector, the public sector, local and international, know more about the opportunities and about the parameters for successful infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Julia, Freddie, Thomas, and thanks to the organizers for this, our first Google Hangout on this really fascinating and energizing topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.